This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider.
The national lockdown is the last line of defence. It is the thing that we can do to keep people safe if that's needed.
From first light, the Health Secretary Matt Hancock was doing television and radio interviews, this one on BBC Breakfast, stressing that the government wants to avoid a national lockdown, but not ruling it out. What they're calling a 2-week circuit breaker is on the table, which could see a temporary ban on friends socialising and shorter hours or closures of pubs and restaurants. Our editorial column is concerned how an economy already hammered by the virus would handle further restrictions.
The fact that such draconian measures are even being contemplated makes it imperative that the whole government is prepared, particularly Chancellor Rishi Sunak. He is already under pressure to replace his successful furlough scheme with targeted measures to help those industries which are still struggling to survive. The Chancellor's record gives this newspaper optimism that he can do so, but the same can't be said of our view of the Prime Minister's performance. Boris Johnson has been absent from battle too often, repeatedly leaving it to ministers to answer the difficult questions. It's time Mr Johnson communicates leadership. Even if behind the scenes he is operating effectively, we certainly don't feel it.
Our political editor Joe Murphy is here. Joe, is a second lockdown a realistic possibility?
It is a realistic possibility, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, and I certainly wouldn't want to scare anybody into thinking wrongly that we're going to have another blanket national lockdown as we had from March the 22nd through to June, July. I'm pretty certain that's not going to happen at the moment. The numbers don't remotely justify it, but there are big increases going on of the number of cases per 100,000 people. And the R rate is probably a little over 1 in many places. And that means that there are going to be some restrictions, I think, in London before long. That kind of national blanket lockdown where people have to stay at home, nobody's talking about that as a possibility at the moment. What instead, and this is a real change, is we're looking at social lockdowns. And I think these are going to be coming to London during October.
And what would that look like?
Well, the scientific research over the summer, research that I'm sure was aided by the Eat Out to Help Out campaign, which got everybody out socialising and having a good time in August. But what that's shown is that the vast majority of infections that people get is not from strangers on the tube or from people passing you in corridors or in the park. The vast majority of transmissions actually take place from friend to friend and within families when people are socialising and in their own homes. And so the restrictions that we're looking at will be targeting that sort of activity. So you've seen some of this being brought in the north. The northwest today has had curfews where they close entertainment venues from 10 o'clock, where they bar people from socialising between different households or with friends. And these are actually quite severe restrictions on individual freedoms and the ability to have fun. But by doing so, they hope to maintain the prize of schools being open so children get an education, and workplaces being open for as many people as possible so that people can make a living and keep the economy going.
Is that what this circuit breaker that some ministers have been talking about is about?
Yeah, the circuit breaker is an interesting idea. It's a bit like when Boris Johnson the other day used that very old-fashioned phrase, a stitch in time saves 9. A 2-week fire break, if you like, to try and slow the surge down, and at the end of it, hopefully, we'll just go along at a more moderate pace of infections rather than letting it get out of control. And that's important because if you look over the channel, you see hospitals filling up in Madrid, you see very high infection rates in France now, and the Health Secretary said today, I fear more people may die. That's a heavy warning.
If we do have further restrictions, though, if there are shorter hours for pubs or closures on restaurants, can Britain afford it?
That's a really interesting question, and we're hearing of 2 meetings this week that were absolutely critical. On Wednesday night, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientist and Chief Medical Officer, were advising we need the fire break, we need the circuit breaker, that attempt to slow things down. And on Thursday, the Chancellor had a meeting at number 10 where he is said to have presented the Prime Minister with some extremely worrying forecasts for what would happen to the economy if we go into any form of severe or extended lockdown. So this is where you come on to the Prime Minister's hope, a stitch in time, will save that heavy lockdown, that blanket lockdown from happening, and hopefully mean that at the end of all this, we'll be able to balance the books again one day.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.